Friends, I Fi you want to watch super hit movie 28 Years Later. English, then you must like this video. If you are visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to subscribe West Films to our channels in today's video. The movie we're going to talk about is called 28 Years Later. We will talk about what this movie is and where you can watch it, all the interesting facts about this movie in today's video. I'm going to tell you, I'm also going to give you all the information on which OTT platform or on which satellite channel you will get to watch this movie. Also, we will talk in detail about the technical department, music department, pre-production, filming, post-production, budget, box office, collection of this film. We will also talk about the story of this film, and I will also give you a small review of the story of this film apart from this. We will discuss about the facts of this film's storyline, star-cast actors' performance in the film, and which character has played which role. That's why I request you friends to watch this video till the end. So let's start the video. 28 Years Later is a 2025 post. Apocalyptic horror film produced and directed by Danny Boyle and written by Alex Garland. The third installment in the 28 Days Later film series, following 28 Days Later, 2002, and 28 Weeks Later, 2007, it stars Jodie Comer, Aaron Taylor Johnson, Alfie Williams in his feature film debut, and Ralph Fiennes. The film marks the returns of Boyle, Garland, and cinematographer Anthony Dodd Mantle to the series, all of whom worked on the original film, with Cillian Murphy also serving as executive producer. It is unique in that it is one of very few movies that used iPhone cameras to film scenes. 28 Years Later was released in the United Kingdom and the United States by Columbia Pictures through Sony Pictures, releasing on the 20th of June 2025. The film received positive reviews from critics. It was shot back-to-back with its sequel, 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, set to be released in January 2026. Plot: in 2002, during the initial outbreak of the rage virus, a young boy named Jimmy escapes from his house in the Scottish Highlands after an attack by the rage-infected results in his entire family being infected. He escapes to a nearby church, where he finds his father, the local vicar, praying. Believing the outbreak to be a sign of divine judgment, the vicar reacts with religious fervor, interpreting the virus as a harbinger of the end of times. He gives Jimmy a crucifix necklace and urges him to flee before allowing himself to be overtaken by the infected, enabling Jimmy to escape. 28 years after the second outbreak, B. The rage virus has been eradicated in continental Europe, and the British Isles remain under indefinite quarantine. A small community of survivors lives in a village on Lindisfarne, an island connected to the mainland by a heavily fortified tidal causeway. Among the residents are Jamie, a scavenger, his wife, Isla, who suffers from an unexplained illness, and their 12-year-old son, Spike. As part of a coming-of-age ritual, Jamie takes Spike to the mainland to hunt. They encounter a pack of infected, led by an alpha, a mutated variant of the infected, who are stronger and more intelligent. The pair takes refuge in an abandoned cottage and observes a distant bonfire. Upon returning to Lindisfarne, Spike learns that the fire was lit by Dr. Ian Kelson, a reclusive survivor whom the villagers fear. According to rumor, Kelson has been seen burning bodies in what appears to be ritualistic fashion. Spike becomes disillusioned with his father when he sees him having an affair with another woman. He secretly returns to the mainland with his mother, hoping that Kelson can provide treatment. At the same time, Swedish NATO soldier Erik Sundqvist and his unit are forced to shore after their patrol boat sinks. The unit is quickly overwhelmed by the infected, and Erik becomes the sole survivor. He eventually encounters Spike and Isla and rescues them from another pack of infected and joins their search for Kelson. The group later finds a pregnant infected woman giving birth to an uninfected infant. Erik kills the mother and prepares to kill the child, but an alpha intervenes and decapitates him. The alpha chases Spike and Isla until Kelson appears and subdues it using a morphine-laced blow dart. He then leads Spike, Isla, and the infant to his sanctuary, which is a temple constructed from sterilized bones of the bodies. He cleans and adds Erik's skull to the temple. After examining Isla, Kelson determines that she has terminal cancer. At her request, he euthanizes her by using a morphine dart. He presents her clean skull to Spike, who climbs to the top of the temple and places it there as a memorial. Following another confrontation with the Alpha, Spike and Kelson manage to escape. Spike returns to Lindisfarne alone and leaves the infant, whom he names Isla, at the village gate. He includes a note addressed to Jamie, explaining the child's origins and stating that he will return when he is ready. Realizing Spike has gone into the mainland alone, Jamie attempts to go after him but is unable to due to the high tide. 28 days later, while evading a group of infected on the mainland, Spike is rescued by a cult of garishly dressed survivors led by a man calling himself Sir Jimmy, who wears the crucifix his father gave him during the initial outbreak. Cast: Alfie Williams as Spike, Jamie and Isla's 12-year-old son. Jodie Comer as Hila, Jamie's wife who is battling a mysterious illness. Aaron Taylor Johnson as Jamie, a scavenger and Isla's husband. Ralph Fiennes as Dr. Ian Kelson, a survivor of the outbreak. Edvin Reding as Eric Sundqvist, a Swedish NATO soldier. Chai Lewis Perry as Samson, a physically imposing alpha leader of the infected. Christopher Fulford as Sam, a friend of Jamie's and a resident on the island. Amy Cameron as Rosie, Jamie's secret lover, and a resident on the island. Stella Gannett as Jenny, a member of the island's leadership council. Jack O'Connell as Sir Jimmy Crystal, a cult leader of Jimmy's and survivor of the original outbreak. Production. Development. In June 2007, Fox Atomic confirmed development on a third 28 Days Later film, dependent upon the financial performance of 28 weeks later following its home video release. In July of the same year, Danny Boyle said that the story for a third installment had been mapped out 6. By October 2010, Alex Garland stated that due to differences involving the film rights, the project had been delayed. In January 2011, Boyle stated that he believed the project would be realized, confirming further developments for the story. By April 2013, however, the filmmaker expressed uncertainty as to whether the movie would be made. In January 2015, Garland addressed the project's status, confirming that while it had fallen into development hell, there were serious discussions going on behind the scenes to produce the project. Reiterating that development was progressing, he stated that the script he was working on would tentatively be titled 28 Months Later. In June 2019, Boyle confirmed that he and Garland had been working on the third installment. In March 2020, Imogen Poots expressed interest in reprising her role from the second film, followed by Cillian Murphy in May 2021. In November 2022, Boyle, Garland, and actor Murphy all indicated their interest in making a sequel to 28 Days Later. In June 2023, Boyle and Garland expressed in collaboration their intentions to seriously and diligently see the project enter production, while announcing that the script was now titled 28 Years Later, acknowledging the years it had taken to be developed. Boyle stated that he would like to serve as director, unless Garland chooses to. By July of the same year, Murphy stated that he had recently discussed the possibility of a third film with Boyle, once again expressing interest in reprising his role if Boyle and Garland returned to the franchise in their creative roles. In January 2024, it was announced that a third film titled 28 Years Later was officially in development, with plans for the project to be the first of a new trilogy of sequels. Danny Boyle will direct the first installment with a script written by Alex Garland, while the latter will also write the scripts for each of the planned sequels. Boyle, Garland, Andrew Macdonald, and Peter Rice will serve as producers. In February of the same year, Murphy discussed his potential involvement with the project. That same month, Macdonald had bought back the rights to the first film from Searchlight Pictures, promptly selling it to Sony Pictures for future distribution, as well as rights to future sequels. In March 2024, Garland confirmed that he is writing a trilogy of sequel films. The following month, Garland stated the film Kes was a major influence on his work for 28 Years Later. Murphy was revealed as an executive producer later that month. The film was produced by Columbia Pictures and DNA Films. Casting. In April, Aaron Taylor Johnson, Jodie Comer, and Ralph Fiennes were cast to star, with Jack O'Connell joining the cast in May. It was initially reported that Cillian Murphy would reprise his role as Jim, but in January 2025, the film's producer Andrew Macdonald confirmed he would not appear, though he remains an executive producer. Aaron Kellyman was added to the cast in June. Filming. Principal photography began on the 7th of May 2024 in Northumberland, with Anthony Dodd Mantle serving as the cinematographer. Filming wrapped on the 29th of July. The film was primarily shot using an iPhone 15 Pro Max, in addition to action cameras, drones, and other digital and film cameras. The use of small digital cameras harks back to filming the original 28 Days Later using the Canon XL1 digital camcorder, which was maneuverable enough to film the deserted locales within the time limits allowed by officials. Filming mainly took place in the north of England, in the northeast and Yorkshire and the Humber regions. Locations include Holy Island, Lindisfarne off the Northumberland coast, Hexham, Bellingham, Kielder Forest, Rothbury, Northumberland, Newcastle upon Tyne, Tyne and Wear, Waskerley, County Durham, Melsonby, Ripon, Fountains Abbey, Aysgarth Falls, Redmire, North Yorkshire, and Bradford, West Yorkshire. Some scenes were filmed at Planky Mill Farm, near Langley and Barden Mill, Northumberland. In addition, some filming took place in Cheddar Gorge in Somerset in southwest England. Music. In May 2025, Young Fathers was confirmed in composing the film's soundtrack, succeeding previous composer John Murphy. The soundtrack was released on Milan Records on the 20th of June 2025. Release. 28 Years Later was released in the United Kingdom, United States, and Canada by Sony Pictures, releasing on 20th of June 2025. The first trailer was released on the 10th of December 2024. It features the 1903 poem Boots by Rudyard Kipling, recited by American actor Taylor Holmes in 1915. The trailer became #1 trending on YouTube and in 48 hours had over 10 million views. Stuart Heritage, the film critic for The Guardian, particularly noted the use of Holmes's spoken word recording of Boots and commented, "As of now, though, it's just about the most exciting film of 2025, and this is entirely down to its trailer." The trailer's viral success led to Sony's decision to re-release the original 28 Days Later film on digital platforms on the 18th of December 2024, 2 years after it had been made unavailable by its former distributor, Disney. Reception. Box office. In the United States and Canada, 28 Years Later was released alongside Elio and is expected to gross around $30 million in its opening weekend from 3,444 theaters, with some estimates going as high as $45 million. The film made $14 million on its first day, including $5.8 million from Thursday previews. Critical response. On the review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes, 89% of 203 critics' reviews are positive. The website's consensus reads, 28 Years Later taps into contemporary anxieties with the ferocious urgency of someone infected with rage virus, delivering a haunting and visceral thrill ride that defies expectations. Metacritic, which uses a weighted average, assigned the film a score of 76 out of 100 based on 52 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. Audiences polled by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of B on an A+ to F scale, while 52% of those surveyed post-track said they would definitely recommend it. Robbie Collin of the Daily Telegraph gave the film 5 stars, writing, "Call it December Owl and Pressburger, an unholy hybrid of A Canterbury Tale and Cannibal Holocaust, which Boyle was perhaps uniquely placed to pull off, and which stands as his finest film since 2008's Slumdog Millionaire." Ed Potton of The Times also gave it 5 stars, writing, "The sense of hallucinogenic sweatiness won't be to everyone's taste, but Garland and Boyle should be applauded for taking such big swings and having the flair and confidence to pull them off. It's an astonishing piece of work." Rolling Stone's David Fear wrote, "Whether it all comes together as a satisfactory whole or is merely a sum of parts extension with little more to say is anyone's guess." Taken on its own, however, Boyle and Garland's trip back to this hellscape makes the most of casting a jaundiced, bloodshot eye at our current moment. The Independent's Clarice Loffrey gave it 3/5 stars, describing it as a post-Brexit COVID-conscious take on this world, with ideas about nationalism, isolationism, and weaponized culture added to the mix. But it's punchy and simple once again. Kyle Smith of the Wall Street Journal was more critical, writing, "Mr. Boyle has made more than his share of memorable films, but he has also delivered some stinkers, and unfortunately his new one carries the fragrance of a zombie underarm." Adam Graham of the Detroit News gave it a D grade, calling it an uneven mix of horror movie gnarliness and human melancholia that never finds even ground or a consistent tone, and may make viewers reel from genre whiplash. Rotten Tomatoes lists the film on its 100 best zombie movies, ranked by Tomatometer. Sequel. Main article, 28 years later, The Bone Temple. In April 2024, Nia DaCosta was reportedly in negotiations to direct a sequel to the film, the second part of a planned trilogy, with Boyle, Garland, Macdonald, Rice, and Bernie Bellew attached as producers. In June 2024, via a copyright filing, the title of the film was seemingly revealed to be 28 years later, The Bone Temple. On the 18th of August 2024, during a talk at the Edinburgh International Film Festival, Macdonald confirmed DaCosta would be directing the sequel, and said that principal photography was set to begin the following day. Macdonald also talked about potential plans for a third 28 years later film, saying, "We hope there is going to be a third part, and there is a trilogy." 28 years later review. In 28 days later, it took less than 4 weeks to transform London, one of the world's busiest and most advanced cities, into an inhospitable ghost town after an outbreak of the ultra-contagious rage virus struck the human population. Just imagine what another 10,000 or so days might do. That's where boundary-pushing director Danny Boyle and speculative fiction superbrain Alex Garland pick up their 2002 dystopian horror saga with 28 years later, swinging to the opposite end of the UK to follow an entirely new set of characters. You don't have to be a math whiz to spot that the creative duo are 5 years ahead of schedule. But when Boyle and Garland landed on a compelling enough reason to check back on the now quarantined country, it hardly seems reasonable to wait. And what better catalyst could there be than the real-world disruptions caused by self-imposed isolation, Brexit, and a once-in-a-century global pandemic, COVID-19? Where the original film tapped into society's collective fear of infection, its decades-later follow-up, which undoes any developments implied by 28 weeks later with an opening chyron that explains the rage virus was driven back from continental Europe, zeroes in on two even more primal anxieties: fear of death, and fear of the other. To which you might well ask, aren't all horror movies about surviving an unknown threat of some kind? Yes, but few have assumed the psychic toll taken by such violence, or stared death directly in the bloodshot eyes quite so effectively. Though conceived as the start of a new trilogy, 28 years later towers on its own merits. Part 2, subtitled The Bone Temple, is in the can and expected next January. Apart from its first and last scenes, which introduce a charismatic lad named Jimmy, played by Sinners villain Jack O'Connell, who learns to defend himself after seeing his local priest and parents killed, the film focuses on a small collective that has taken refuge on Holy Island, just off the coast of northern England. The nearby Scottish mainland is literally crawling with the infected, a new strain of which are blubbery, slow-moving scavengers who eat earthworms off the forest floor. They're disgusting, but little danger to Jamie, Aaron Taylor Johnson, or his 12-year-old son, Spike, Alfie Williams, whom he's taken ashore for a father-son foraging mission, the boy's maiden trek beyond the walls. Spike is cocky at first, but freezes up when it comes time to shoot. He's been training with the bow and arrow, but shakes uncontrollably at the prospect of killing an onrushing attacker. Perhaps he wasn't expecting them to look so much like the good people back home, minus the clothes and attention to hygiene. In the most spectacular leg of the pair's surreal excursion, Jamie drags his son across a half-submerged causeway, while a cheetah-quick, silverback-strong berserker sprints after them. The sequence looks positively hallucinatory, illuminated by night stars and aurora borealis streaks in the sky above. Nothing about the film's look, From unnerving avant-garde inserts of medieval soldiers to infrared flashes of the oft-misunderstood infected, could be described as conventional. That's a logical next step from 28 Days Later, which Boyle shot using low-grade digital cameras. It hurts the eyes to revisit that footage on today's high-def formats. Revolutionary as the film was for its time. Here, the radical stylist, responsible for train spotting and trance, updates his technology to cutting-edge iPhones, which maintain a similarly unsettling home video edge without compromising the clarity or the aspect ratio, a dramatic, ultra-panoramic frame that's nearly 3 times as wide as it is tall. Such lightweight equipment gives DP Anthony Dodd Mantle enormous flexibility, whether tracking action by hand or squeezing into tight spaces. Editor John Harris adds another edge, unpredictably jumping axis and splicing in non-diegetic elements in strategic defiance of traditional visual logic. Things settle down somewhat after Spike returns home to process what he's just witnessed. In the wild, he spotted a far-off bonfire where a rogue doctor, Ian Kelson, Ralph Fiennes, is said to be burning corpses by the hundreds. Someone it's hard not to imagine as the iodine-smeared Colonel Kurtz in this heart of darkness, until such time as his own secrets come to light. Something's wrong with Spike's mother, Jodie Comer, who seems disoriented and combative at times. Centuries earlier, she might have been labeled a witch. Now there's a good chance she could be infected with something. A new strain of rage, perhaps? Finding his courage, Spike convinces his mom to follow him back out into the world, hoping to find a cure or simply some kind of explanation. Doing so means risking death, or worse, exposing either of them to the mutating virus, which has produced intimidating new alphas who swell up and stand tall, striking fresh fear in the audience. Transmitted by blood, rage doesn't kill people outright, but functions like a fast-acting form of rabies, sending the infected into an instant hyper-aggressive frenzy. Fans of 28 Days Later credit Boyle with accelerating the lumbering zombie movie trope. Instead of getting bitten and waiting hours or days to become brain-dead flesh-eaters, always the most tedious part of Romero-era zombie classics, Boyle's infected switched over within seconds. Technically speaking, these frightening creatures aren't zombies, and though our heroes, Cillian Murphy and Naomi Harris, both MIA in this movie, didn't hesitate to kill the so-called infected in the original, this sequel restores their humanity. There's still no antidote, mind you, but that doesn't mean these poor, rage-compromised souls don't merit a bit of respect, which Garland generously bestows in the film's contemplative bone temple scene. One doesn't expect a high-tension genre movie to suddenly turn eschatological in the home stretch, but that pivot mirrors the original, which spent its final third at a mansion in Manchester, where soldiers proved a greater threat than the infected. Where the Manchester scene showed how quickly moral collapse followed such a pandemic, demonstrating that human nature didn't need rage to unleash its aggressive tendencies, Fiennes' scenes provide a more optimistic outlook. As Kelson puts it, the infected and uninfected are more alike than we care to admit. Surviving COVID taught us that, whereas the AIDS crisis was more complicated since many cast judgment on how the virus was passed, the movie invites such thoughts, along with reflection on our own mortality. Typically, we look to adrenaline-fueled entertainment for catharsis. Boyle's thrilling reboot offers enlightenment as well. Here they are again, Danny Boyle and Alex Garland's zombies. Though unlike the usual stumbling slow movers, of course, these things can sprint like Tom Cruise on steroids. Back in 2002, screenwriter Garland and director Boyle had a monster hit with their post-apocalyptic horror thriller 28 Days Later about a rage virus that leaks from a lab and, turning people into aggressive zombies, causes a complete law and order breakdown in 28 days. Boyle famously made smart use of then-new lightweight digital tech, which let him bring off miracles of unlicensed guerrilla shooting at dawn in the deserted London streets. That was fierce, muscular filmmaking, though I have never been a fan of zombies whose masked presence, then as now, requires silly, gurning, ketchup-strewn extras who can't be clearly looked at for any length of time without getting a laugh. For my money, it was only Edgar Wright's zombie horror comedy Shaun of the Dead, which came out 2 years afterwards, which fully explored the real, intimate horror of zombieism, the gap between being bitten and transforming. In 2007, a lackluster sequel, 28 Weeks Later, brought the franchise stumbling to a halt. Now we have 28 years later, an interesting, tonally uncertain development which takes a generational, even evolutionary leap into the future from the initial catastrophe, creating something that mixes folk horror, Little England satire, and even a grieving process for all that has happened. And there are some colossal cameo appearances. We are now on Holy Island off England's northeast coast, where a barricaded, self-governing community grows its own food, brews its own beer, and stays apart from the British mainland, which is a lawless, quarantined hellhole where zombies roam free, procreating and living off the vast herds of unculled deer. There is a startling, unintended moment of sadness, incidentally. We get a glimpse of the sycamore gap tree near Hadrian's Wall, evidently filmed before it was cut down. The Holy Island menfolk make foraging expeditions across the water via the causeway at low tide, killing zombies with bows and arrows to burnish their hunter-gatherer instincts. Some of these zombies are alpha runners, but others are slow movers, natural for target practice, bulbous creatures crawling on their stomachs. Spike, Alfie Williams, is a 12-year-old kid whose adored mum Isla, Jodie Comer, is unwell, confused, and depressed. His dad, Jamie, Aaron Taylor Johnson, takes Spike on a sortie to the mainland, a rite of passage which brings him to manhood. But then Spike becomes obsessed with rumors of a doctor still living in this danger zone who carries out bizarre rituals like a cross between Marlon Brando and Dennis Hopper in Apocalypse Now. Spike disobeys all the island's rules by taking his mum with him out into this forbidden area on a desperate quest to find this doctor who can cure her. Holy Island is certainly a fascinating place, ripe for scary filmmaking, as Roman Polanski showed with his 1966 movie Cul-de-sac. Garland and Boyle give us some intriguing hints as to how the community has regressed into a kind of fortress mentality, living like a Stone Age version of the 50s. Archive clips of the Archers of Agincourt in Olivier's Henry V show their subconscious groupthink. Pugnacious reliance on ancient warrior craft and a profound mistrust of the French. But a little awkwardly, the film has to get us onto the mainland for some badass action sequences with real shooting weaponry, and then we have the two alpha cameos that it would be unsporting to reveal, but which cause the film to shunt between deep sadness and a bizarre, implausible, though certainly startling, graphic novel strangeness, there to promote franchise continuation. So the zombies carry on at their dual speed, intriguing, but going in circles. Ever since IP-driven cinema took over, we've long missed the pleasure of being surprised. Long before they popped on the screen, we know going into whatever comic book movie or long-standing property what Easter eggs or callbacks would be engineered to delight us. Much of blockbuster cinema is now fast food service, and everyone has seen the menu. But moviegoers shouldn't have it their way. Their imaginations should be conjured and pushed, stretched, and piqued. In situations where a studio decides to revive a crowd favorite, they should allow the filmmakers behind that work to allow their reintroduction to be bold, shocking, and weird. Danny Boyle's 28 Years Later, a zombified IP, returns the director to the gory terrain he first forged with the grungy 28 Days Later. It also sees him reteaming with Alex Garland, who after launching a successful directorial career, Annihilation, is back penning a franchise he authored as screenwriter for 28 Days Later and produced its sequel 28 Weeks Later. That's nearly where the nostalgia ends, because whatever you think the third edition in this trilogy could be, Boyle and Garland gleefully subvert it. Instead, 28 years later, an at times tonally daring and whimsically transportive coming-of-age zombie film does the exact opposite of what you expect. Though this horror flick anticipates the coming of the Nia DaCosta-helmed sequel, 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, it refreshingly doesn't operate by the logic of franchise building. It's a gnarly piece of gruesome art. 28 Years Later is theoretically a zombie movie, until it isn't. The oddball film begins with a group of children in the Scottish Highlands during the opening days of a virus rendering many into flesh-eating monsters, watching an episode of the Teletubbies. Their momentary peace is interrupted when a horde of raging flesh-eaters come bursting through their cottage doors and windows. While many are slaughtered, one child escapes. He runs to his dad, a priest praying in a church, who interprets this wave of destruction as the fruition of biblical prophecy. Though the father will be consumed, the son will escape. His ultimate fate won't be revealed until the film's end. In the meantime, Boyle and Garland, like the trilogy's other cold opens, push us forward in time. Soon, it's 28 years later, and we're in a hamlet surrounded by water. Rather than returning us to London, where the action of the first two films take place, the filmmakers decide to shift us to a Northumberland isle called Holy Island, to show us how a quarantined people have created a new isolationist community. Here we settle on a different boy, a 12-year-old Spike, Alfie Williams, preparing to go on his first hunt with his strapping dad, Jamie, Aaron Taylor Johnson. The hunt is a ritual boys go on when they're 14 or 15 years of age. From the jump, however, we can tell Spike is experienced beyond his years in some ways and inexperienced in others. He idolizes his astute father and cares for his ailing mother, Isla, Jodie Comer, a woman so beset by migraines and hallucinations she is bedbound. Their village, an oasis in a sea of terror, is surrounded by water that only recedes during low tide, when a causeway connected to the mainland reveals itself. Boyle stays in this near-cultish village for just long enough to creep us out by presenting their drunken revelries and their religious iconographies. Pulsating and nightmarish, Spike and Jamie's journey into the woods reveal some key details about Garland's world building. There are now several kinds of zombies. Some are slow-moving, obese creatures that crawl on the floor, while others are the naked and twitchy sprinting types. But there's one that stands above them all, a tall, hulking giant Jamie calls an alpha, who not only possesses super strength and speed, but is also far more intelligent than his counterparts. The alpha interrupts Spike's first hunt, causing father and son to take shelter, where Spike spots a seemingly unexplainable fire in the distance, operated by the supposedly insane doctor, Ian Kelson, Ralph Fiennes. Though the pair do eventually return to the village, Spike learns a secret about his father that both causes him to distrust his dad and to abscond back to the mainland with his ailing mother in the hopes that Kelson can provide a cure. What erupts is a kind, screwed-up Wizard of Oz, wherein Spike and his mother meet odd travelers across fields and dales, holding the wish of being healed by this mythical entity. During Spike's journey, you expect some bloody freak-out moments to happen, and while some do occur, with kill shots whose freeze frames often recall Garland's Civil War, the zombies assume the back burner. Instead, Boyle opts for a Brothers Grimm vibe. Spike meets an antsy pregnant zombie and a Swedish soldier carrying news of the outside world. He also cares for his mother in between her moments of lucidity and hallucination. In these scenes, lush, verdant fields and forest green trees take on a fairy tale sheen that differs from the grunge of 28 Days Later and the harsh kineticism of 28 Weeks Later. That softer lens doesn't mean cinematographer Anthony Dodd Mantle's imagery lose any immediacy. The colors wrap you in a dewy dream, knowingly juxtaposed from the apathy of this deadly world. For several reasons, 28 Years Later shouldn't work. On top of the Teletubbies pull, Boyle includes archival footage of British war films, intercut with scenes of Spike's village training themselves. Boyle never really returns to this militarist fervor, except for the appearance of the aforementioned Swedish soldier. He also doesn't really dive deep into the religious critique he's halfway set up. With the latter, we can probably forgive him in anticipation of a sequel harvesting such fertile ground. But considering the conversation 28 Weeks Later initiated on the topic of militarism, however, that theme seems lacking here. Still, this film thrills because of the commitment of Boyle to his vision and the actors willing to come along for this zany ride. Comer, for instance, provides hints of absurdity and vulnerability, oscillating between dazed and confused and painstakingly aware of the burden undertaken by a son asked to mature beyond his years. Unbridled fear gives way to touching and light-hearted moments of frivolity, emboldened by young father's ethereal music. Williams is also a revelation as a kid who eschews cuteness while confronting his own naivety. Meanwhile, Fiennes strongly emerges to give screwy scenes soft notes of touching finality that should crumble under the weight of their own folly. 28 Years Later is a deeply earnest film, a picture whose sincerity is initially off-putting until it's endearing. Toward the end, through the concept of memento mori, this zombie picture attempts to grapple with the toll of the on-screen death that's filled viewers' minds for decades now. It's a desire that isn't inspired by a need to craft elongated arcs, future callbacks, or even the return of former characters. The decision to consider the finality of death and how we remember those who've passed on is a gesture to the human in a franchise filled with the inhuman. Rather than needling our instinct to run, Boyle commands us to stop and mourn, to remember and grieve. Many more days, weeks, and years will pass, but the surprise that is 28 years later has our attention now. Though it hasn't been 28 years since the groundbreaking first addition to the franchise, 28 years later retains the spirit of the original film, but isn't afraid to evolve. Danny Boyle and Alex Garland make their return as the director-writer pair behind the movie after being absent from 28 weeks later. They take full advantage of the increased budget and creative freedom at their fingertips this time around. 28 Years Later is less a long-awaited sequel and more of a reboot, bringing the franchise into the modern, grief-stricken landscape of contemporary horror movies. The post-apocalypse genre is at an interesting place, as by the time we catch up with young Spike, played by Alfie Williams, a whole generation of people has grown up after the end of the world. The movie is a more emotional, character-driven drama that's punctuated by zombies rather than a true genre flick. While this might not be what audiences are expecting, it's probably a good thing for the franchise's future. As this doesn't feel like a copy and paste attempt to recapture the spark of 28 Days Later, it's something new. Though film and television feel inundated by zombies, 28 Years Later is aware of the influences from TV to video games that have sprung up and were in turn inspired by the original 2002 film. 28 Days Later revitalized the zombie genre, but now 28 Years Later is forced to enter an oversaturated genre that's been explored in every way audiences can imagine. Fortunately, the film takes this as an opportunity rather than an obstacle, and genuinely tries to avoid many tropes, only leaning into them for the fun of it. After being heralded as the man who reinvented the zombie genre with 28 Days Later, Boyle had his work cut out for him with 28 Years Later, which skirts the less acclaimed 28 Weeks Later. In quick succession, the movie sets up the rules, stakes, and tension, using the dizzying camera work of iPhone footage with plenty of Dutch angles. It's a natural evolution of the run-and-gun style that was necessary for 28 Days Later. However, this time Boyle gets to play with the images to enhance the narrative, and it works for the movie. Inherently, 28 Years Later doesn't have the earth-shattering stakes of the first two movies. It never could, and it doesn't try to. Instead of trying to tackle the global impact and scale of a crisis like this, the story narrows in scope, focusing on Spike's small island and his personal relationship with his mother and father, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson and Jodie Comer. Taylor Johnson is handsome and charming as Spike's flawed father, but it's impossible for him to avoid some overacting as he's asked to be larger than life. Conversely, Comer has a tough job, as she's more likable than Taylor Johnson because of her character's position in the story. However, she's no less required to lay the melodrama on a little thick. Williams is able to anchor the project because the plot and supporting characters do most of the heavy lifting in crafting the story's world. Spike is a sweet protagonist, and it's an interesting choice to center on a child's experience, reminding us that there are people coming after us who will inherit the earth and everything we've done to it. I felt the heart-pounding thrill of 28 Years Later many times over throughout the nearly 2-hour runtime, and this is what helped the movie fly by. The film has you in its grip for a long time, but takes the easy way out at the beginning of the third act in favor of a setup for the coming sequel. It's here that the pacing, so far fairly deliberate, starts to come undone. Amid the video game-esque kill shots and homages to military mobilization, the stakes of Spike's story and his emotional through line are a little weak, never quite hitting the mark. No one but Ralph Fiennes could have delivered such poignant monologues about death and acceptance without fully taking me out of the story. When his character appears, there's a significant tonal shift, and the movie's intention to wrap up and tie up loose ends is palpable. 28 years later doesn't take itself too seriously for the most part, but it's through Fiennes' character that Garland and Boyle attempt to impart some wisdom about humanity and death upon the audience. It's not unwelcome, but it's a little out of place. 28 years later hits all the benchmarks a post-apocalyptic movie should. It provides context about how people live, giving insight into the outside world, and lets the project feel satisfyingly rough and moss-covered. Spending time inside this otherworldly and at times beautiful alternate reality is thrilling but never terrifying. I don't think Boyle or Garland are trying too hard to scare us. These days, it's easy for a horror movie to shock you with gore. It's harder for it to hit its emotional beats. 28 years later isn't perfect on this front, but it's working overtime to get there. By the end of the story, it fully sinks in that from the very first sequence of the film, 28 years later has been setting itself up for a sequel. While the intention behind the project might always have been to make sequels, it almost wouldn't make sense to watch 28 years later as a standalone. Though the propulsive pace is what piques our interest, I get the feeling that the story is already long gone by the time they've caught up to it. Fortunately, I didn't mind chasing down 28 years later. In 28 Years Later, A Melancholy Poem to New Beginnings, director Danny Boyle and writer Alex Garland revisit the rage-infected world they created in 2002. With 28 Days Later, the filmmakers restarted the zombie genre for the 21st century, leading to one sequel 28 weeks later, 2007, countless imitators, and a resurgence of flesh-eating ghouls in horror cinema and pop culture that has continued well beyond the point of overexposure. Returning to what they started, Boyle and Garland have much on their minds, none of which could be called conventional. The new feature isn't merely another kinetic exploration of epidemic survivors running about the UK from fast-moving infected. The world has changed since then, and the filmmakers' approach has evolved along with it. Their film comments on the last quarter century of radicalization through Christian rapture theology, nationalism, traditionalism, and the manosphere, delivering an elusive critique of the lot. 28 Years Later is anything but straightforward post-apocalypse or zombie-adjacent fare, and it will undoubtedly confound audiences expecting Hollywood's predictable legacy sequel or requel treatment. That's part of what makes it special. A sharp contrast to Boyle's last movie, Yesterday, 2019, a light, high-concept yarn more appropriately attributed to its writer, Richard Curtis. 28 Years Later finds the director once again crafting an inspired sequel to a film that solidified his reputation as a celebrated British auteur. Just as he revisited the characters from Trainspotting, 1996, with the dispirited yet no less vital and energetic T2 Trainspotting, 2017, his long-discussed second sequel to 28 Days Later thrives on deeper themes. Some of these Boyle echoes with visuals evocatively embedded into the proceedings by editor John Harris for an almost subliminal effect, such as archival footage of British soldiers marching and imagery of archers from Laurence Olivier's Henry V, 1944, shooting arrows. On the soundtrack, Boyle deploys a hypnotic chant of Rudyard Kipling's poem, Boots, recorded in 1915 by actor Taylor Holmes. This pointedly relentless and repetitive text underscores the psychological numbing and scarring of soldiers adherent to their cause. Through these intertexts, Boyle and Garland question the blind obedience and order expected by social and political groups and how they weigh on the individual. Their dark fairy tale follows a 12-year-old boy, Spike, played in a subtle yet affecting performance by Alfie Williams, who breaks away from his father and, by extension, his rule-bound community. Living on a small island within the quarantine zone, the entire UK, whereas the rest of the planet has returned to normalcy, Spike has reached the age where his village expects him to prove his readiness for manhood on the mainland of northern England, still teeming with the rage virus. Though Spike is young, his father Jamie, Aaron Taylor Johnson, his Craven the Hunter swagger intact, believes he's ready. Spike isn't confident about his bow and arrow skills, and he would rather remain home with his mother, Isla, Jodie Comer, who's stricken with a mysterious illness, including fevers and periodic senility. They have no real doctors on their island, so her ailment remains a mystery. Even so, led by his father, Spike must cross the narrow causeway that separates their tidal island from the mainland to test his training. While Spike makes his first kill, the film considers how the infected have evolved in the last quarter century. They've been around long enough that most of their clothes have rotted and fallen away, leaving throngs of naked infected to roam the landscape. Chubby iterations squirm on the forest ground, slurping worms and whatever else crosses their path. Garland also takes a cue from George A. Romero, who fathered the cinematic zombie with Night of the Living Dead, 1968, and whose reanimated corpses became smarter with each successive film. By the time Romero made his fourth installment, Land of the Dead, 2005, greenlit in the zombies' post-28 Days Later return to the zeitgeist, ironically enough, he introduced a thinking zombie called Big Daddy. Garland's equivalent is an alpha, a type smarter than the usual infected, boasting a swinging dick hypermasculinity. Alphas have a penchant for tearing off heads with the spinal column attached and charging victims with the horrifyingly unstoppable momentum of a juggernaut. They lead a pack of infected people who survive on the local deer population and even procreate. Boyle and Garland suggest that those infected with rage no longer starve and die out, as they did in the original. They form a community around their shared rage, just as they do today in digital and socio-political bubbles. After narrowly surviving his overnight sojourn to northern England, Spike becomes disillusioned by his father's mounting deceptions, one of them being that the only known doctor, Dr. Kelson, Ralph Fiennes, a general practitioner before the UK collapsed, is now insane and collects human corpses on the mainland for who knows what purpose. Desperate to help his mother, Spike sneaks back with Isla, who's in varying states of delirium, hoping to find Kelson and cure his mother. Along the way, an interlude with an amusingly embittered Swedish soldier, Edvin Riding, whose quarantine patrol boat was unfortunate enough to sink nearby, gives Spike his first exposure to another way of living, prompting his introduction to a smartphone, followed by an amusing critique of today's cosmetically altered beauty standards. When they finally encounter Dr. Kelson, he looks chilling, given his regular body-wide applications of iodine to ward off the virus. He also introduces Spike to new ideas, such as paying tribute to the dead with an elaborate memento mori, a forest and tower assembled from bones. Ever the electric visualist, Boyle and his returning cinematographer Anthony Dodd Mantle imbue 28 years later with a different kind of energy. Certain angles and scenes crackle with the same force as the 2002 film, with Mantle's iPhone cameras replacing the consumer-grade mini-DVs from the original. The imagery's soft edges and desaturated colors suggest Boyle and Mantle scrubbed a layer of skin off the footage until it looked similar 28 days later. Along with some impressionistic edits and unnervingly red night vision shots of infected hunting and eating deer, the film engages in visceral and jarring formal choices that register as improvised rather than orderly. Boyle augments scenes with CGI, such as one that portrays an iffy-looking herd of deer. But elsewhere, a digitally assembled scene featuring an alpha running beneath a starry sky adds to the storybook quality of the narrative. Regardless of these choices, 28 Years Later is a far more contemplative and searching film than its two predecessors. It's even quieter, with a less pronounced soundtrack, foregrounding Spike's search for an identity. To whatever degree the credits roll on a disappointingly open-ended note, with a nod toward a sequel, the second of a planned trilogy penned by Garland, reportedly due in January 2026 and subtitled The Bone Temple. The movie concludes fittingly enough with Spike finding someone else like him. This is Jimmy, played by Jack O'Connell, who, following this year's Sinners, plays another cult leader of sorts. Following a shocking introduction in the prologue, Jimmy, like Spike, has a tarnished view of his father, a holy man who welcomes the rage virus as a premillennialist sign of Judgment Day. Jimmy's return in the last sequence is a bizarre, unsatisfying way to end the picture, though his bonkers crew prompts an amusing them in what the fuck reaction to their tracksuits and out there gymnasty kills. After waiting so long for this sequel, I would have preferred a conclusive rather than episodic finale, but it promises another helping of the unexpected to come. A stark commentary on the frightening subcultures operating in our society, which have only worsened since the COVID-19 pandemic, 28 years later, reflects a world where rage has become commonplace, even something to build a community around. For all their ambitious ideas and irregular story choices, Boyle and Garland amplify the humanity on display with tender character descriptions captured in thoughtful performances, particularly from Williams, Comer, and Fiennes. With years of anticipation behind me, I now struggle to articulate what I wanted and expected from this sequel and how the film deviates. And though I cannot claim 28 years later fulfilled my abstract hopes, it's nonetheless an intriguing, moving horror film that, not unlike the aforementioned Sinners, has a reach that goes beyond its subgenre. However, unlike Sinners, it's not an instant triumph. Instead, Boyle and Garland made an expressive film that gave me pause and forced me to contemplate for hours before deciding how I felt about it. Whereas most films strive to align with moviegoer expectations, 28 years later shatters them in a refreshingly unpredictable way. The zombie horror subgenre has been dominant over the last 25 years of film and television, with the likes of Shaun of the Dead, Zombieland, and the Walking Dead franchise all becoming household favorites. However, there is perhaps no greater example of the triumphs of this subgenre than Danny Boyle's 2002 hit movie 28 Days Later, even if the fiends aren't technically zombies. Managing to neatly balance gory thrills and social commentary, the film was so adored upon its release that even the great Stephen King bought 800 opening night tickets. By reshaping how audiences saw zombies, the film has cemented itself as not just one of the best zombie horrors, but one of the best horror movies of all time. Ever since its debut, and despite a 2007 sequel that positively impressed, calls for a big-budget follow-up have been loud from a dedicated fan base. Finally, in January 2024, it was officially announced that prayers had been answered and a sequel titled 28 Years Later was on its way. Ever since, casting information, filming schedules, and even an official release date has been confirmed, with Sony set to distribute the movie worldwide. So, with that in mind, here is a look at everything we know about 28 Years Later so far. It has been officially confirmed that 28 Years Later will arrive on our screens on June 20th, 2025. Already given the coveted summer blockbuster slot, it is clear that plenty of faith is being put into 28 Years Later, with the movie set to release alongside Pixar's Elio, a live-action remake of How to Train Your Dragon, and a hotly anticipated sequel to M3 GAN in a month that already looks to be mouth-watering. 28 Years Later, just like its predecessor, will officially have a worldwide theatrical release. As far as streaming potential goes, although there is not yet any confirmation as to where the movie might end up, given Sony is distributing the feature, it is likely it will make its streaming debut on Netflix sometime after its release. 28 Years Later saw the returns of Danny Boyle and Alex Garland to their respective roles as director and screenwriter. From 28 Days Later, Cillian Murphy, who portrayed the lead role of Jim in Days, returned as an executive producer in June 2007 Fox. Atomic confirmed development on a third 28 Days Later film dependent upon the financial performance of 28 Weeks Later following its home video release, 6 in July of the same year. Danny Boyle said that the story for a third installment had been mapped out 7 by October. 2010. Alex Garland stated that due to differences involving the film rights, the project had been delayed in January 2011. Boyle stated that he believed the project would be realized, confirming further developments for the story at April 2013. However, the filmmaker expressed uncertainty as to whether the movie would be made in January 2015. Garland addressed the project's status, confirming that while it had fallen into development hell, there were serious discussions going on behind the scenes to produce the project, reiterating that development was progressing. He stated that the script he was working on would tentatively be titled 28 months later in June 2090. Boyle confirmed that he and Garland had been working on the third installment in March 2020. Imogen Poots expressed interest in reprising her role from the second film, followed by Cillian Murphy in May 2021 in November 2022, Boyle, Garland, and actor Murphy all making a sequel to 28 Days Later, 15 in June 2023. Boyle and Garland expressed in collaboration their intentions to seriously and diligently see the project enter production, while announcing that the script was now titled 28 Years Later. Acknowledging the years it had taken to be developed, Boyle stated that he would like to serve as director unless Garland chooses to by July of the same year. Murphy stated that he had recently discussed the possibility of a third film with Boyle, once again expressing interest in reprising his role if Boyle and Garland returned to the franchise in their creative roles in January 2024. It was announced that a third film titled 28 Years Later was officially in development, with plans for the project to be the first of a new trilogy of sequels. Danny Boyle will direct the first installment with a script written by Alex Garland, while the latter will also write the scripts for each of the planned sequels. Boyle, Garland, Andrew Macdonald, and Peter Rice will serve as producers in February of the same year. Murphy discussed his potential involvement with the project that same month. Macdonald had bought back the rights to the first film from Searchlight Pictures, promptly selling it to Sony Pictures for future distribution, as well as rights to future sequels in March 2024. Garland confirmed that he's hitting a trilogy of sequel films the following month. Garland stated the film Kess was a major influence on his work for 28 years. Later, Murphy was revealed as an executive producer. Later that the film was produced by Columbia Pictures and DNA Films. Casting in April, Aaron Taylor Johnson, Jodie Cameron, Ralph Fiennes were cast to star 28, with Jack Unnell joining the casting. Mayat Was initially reported that Cillian Murphy would reprise his role as Jim, but in January 2025, the film's producer Andrew Macdonald confirmed he would not appear, though her main executive producer, Aaron Kellyman, was added to the cast in June. Filming principal photography began on May 7, 2024 in Northumberland, with Anthony Doty Mantles serving as the cinematographer. Filming wrapped on July 29th. The film was primarily shot using an iPhone 15 Max 38 in addition to action cameras, drones, and other digital and film cameras. The use of small digital camera sharks back to filming the original 28 Days Later using the Canon XL1 digital camcorder, which was maneuverable enough to film. The deserted locals within the time limits allowed by officials. Filming mainly took place in the north of England, in the northeast, in Yorkshire, and the Humber regions. Locations include Holy Island, Lindisfarne off the Northumberland coast, Hexham, Bellingham, Kielder Forest, Rothbury, Northumberland, Newcastle upon Tyne, Tyne and Weir, Wasserley County, Durham, Melson, Ripon Fountains, Abbey Aysgarth Falls, Redmere, North Yorkshire, and Bradford, West Wye. Yorkshire. Some scenes were filmed at Planky Mill Farm near Langley and Barden Mill, North London. Addition, some filming took place in Cheddar Gorge and Somerset in southwest England. Music in May 2025. Young Fathers was confirmed in composing the film's soundtrack, succeeding previous composer John Murphy. Released 28 years later, was released in the United Kingdom, United States, and Canada by Sony Pictures, releasing on June 20th, 2025. The first trailer was released on December 10th, 2024. It features the 1903 poem Boots by Rudyard Kipling, recited by American actor Taylor Holmes in 1915. The trailer became #1 trending on YouTube, and in 48 hours had over 10 million views. Stuart Heritage, the film critic for The Guardian, particularly noted the use of Holmes's spoken word recording of Boots and commented, "As of now, though, it's just about the most exciting film of 2025, and this is entirely down to its trailer." The trailer's viral success led to Sony's decision to re-release the original 28 Days Later film on digital platforms on December 18th, 2024, 2 years after it had been made unavailable by its former distributor, Disney. 28 years later, movie review. Here they are again. Danny Boyle and Alex Garland zombies, though, unlike the usual stumbling slow movers. Of course, these things can sprint like Tom Cruise and steroids. Back in 2002, screenwriter Garland and director Boyle had a monster hit with their post-apocalyptic horror thriller 28 Days Later about a rage virus that leaks from a lab ant, turning people into aggressive zombies, causes a complete law and order breakdown in 28 days. Boyle famously made smart use of the new lightweight digital tech, which let them bring off miracles of unlicensed guerrilla shooting at dawn in the deserted London streets. That was fierce, muscular film, though I have never been a fan of zombies whose masked presence then as now requires silly, gurning, ketchup-strewn extras who can't be clearly looked at for any length of time without getting a laugh. For my money, it was only Edgar Wright's zombie horror comedy, Shaun of the Dead, which came out 2 years afterwards, which fully explored the real, intimate horror of zombieism. The gap between being bitten and transforming. In 2007, a lackluster sequel, 28 weeks later, brought the franchise stumbling to a halt. Now we have 28 years later an interesting, tonally uncertain development, which takes a generational, even evolutionary leap into the future from the initial catastrophe, creating something that mixes folk horror, Little England satire, and even a grieving process for all that has happened. And there are some colossal cameo appearances. We are now on Holy Island off England's northeast coast, where a barricaded self-governing community grows its own food, brews its own beer, and stays apart from the British mainland, which is a lawless, quarantined hellhole where zombies roam free, procreating and living off the vast herds of uncalled deer. There is a startling moment of sadness. Incidentally, we get a glimpse of the sycamore gap tree near Brienne's Wall, evidently filmed before it was cut down. The Holy Island menfolk make foraging expeditions across the water via the causeway at low tide, killing zombies with bows and arrows to burnish their hunter-gatherer instincts. Some of these zombies are alpha runners, but others are slow movers. Natural for target practice, bulbous creatures crawling on their stomachs spike. Alfie Williams is a 12-year-old kid whose adored mom, Jodie Comer, is unwell. Confused and depressed, his dad, Jamie Aaron Taylor Johnson, takes Spike on a sortie to the mainland, a rite of passage which brings him to manhood. But then Spike becomes obsessed with rumors of a doctor still living in this danger zone who carries out bizarre rituals, like a cross between Marlon Brando and Dennis Hopper in Apocalypse Now. Spike disobeys all the island's rules by taking his mom with him out into this forbidden area on a desperate quest to find this doctor who can cure her. Holy Island is certainly a fascinating place ripe for scary filmmaking, as Roman Polanski showed with his 1966 movie Koldiak. Garland and Boyle give us some intriguing hints as to how the community has regressed into a kind of fortress mentality, living like a Stone Age version of the 50s. Archive clips of the Archers of Aegean Court in Olivier's Henry V show their subconscious groupthink, pugnacious reliance on ancient warrior craft, and a profound mistrust of the French. But a little awkwardly, the film has to get us onto the mainland for some badass action sequences with real shooting weaponry. And then we have the two alpha cameos that it would be unsporting to reveal, but which caused the film to shunt between deep sadness and a bizarre, implausible, though certainly startling graphic novel, Strangest. Their top remote franchise continuation saw the zombies carry on at their dual speed, intriguing but going in circles. The 2002 release of Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later marked a turning point in the long cinematic tradition of zombie horror. Boyle's innovation, in collaboration with screenwriter Alex Garland, director of Civil War and Warfare, was to turn the lumbering undead of horror classics like George Romero's Living Dead series into uncannily fast-moving flesh eaters infected with a highly contagious pathogen known as the rage virus. At the start of a new century and at the new digital information age, fast-moving zombies somehow felt right. The world was changing more swiftly than anyone could keep up with. And the lightning speed of the movie's viscering antagonists, identified not as zombies but as the infected, seemed well suited to what felt like accelerated societal collapse. Over the time span referred to in the film's title, London is transformed from a bustling metropolis into an eerily silent ruin. In 2007 came a sequel, 28 weeks later, not directed by Boyle, Written by Garland, but featuring both as producers and with Boyle directing some second-unit scenes. While not as big a hit or as critically praised as the original, it was a solid continuation of the franchise that became part of a mid-aught wave of zombie content, including movies, Shaun of the Dead, I Am Legend, Zombieland, best-selling novels, World War Z, Pride and Prejudice, and Zombies, and comic books. The Walking Dead series later adapted into multiple TV shows. Now, 5 years short of 28 years since they first reanimated the zombie tradition. Boyle and Garland have returned with 28 years later, a long overdue follow-up that's also intended as the first installment of a new trilogy of sequels. In the post-apocalyptic world of 28 years later, the island of Britain has been cut off entirely from the rest of the world by a strictly enforced quarantine. An island off the Scottish coast connected to the mainland by a causeway that disappears at high tide has become a protected stronghold for a community of uninfected survivors. Without electricity or modern technology, the island's residents live the life of pre-industrial villagers, farming, fishing, and coming together for ritual celebrations. Their lives would seem downright folksy, but for the hordes of flesh-craving monsters kept at bay only by the armed lookouts guarding the island's coastline, among the island's traditions is a coming-of-age ritual for young men who must cross over to the mainland to demonstrate their prowess with a bow and arrow by scoring at least one killing of an infected over the nearly 3 decades since the virus produced the first off the Oz. Unfortunate beings their kind has evolved to include various types. In addition to the hordes of now familiar speeding zombies, there are super air-sized mutants known as alphas, as well as slow and lows fatter creatures that crawl across the ground and subsist in worms when they can't get access to human flesh. Cue multiple extreme close-ups of worms lurping zombies, a signal that the movie to come will seize and run with every opportunity to gross the viewer out as the film begins. His land villager Jamie Aaron Taylor Johnson accompanies his 12-year-old son Spike Alfie Williamson. His rite of passage, the sensitive Spike is terrified by the bloodthirsty creatures he must face, but eager to please his Mako that he takes down one of the chubby ground crawlers, and after a close call with an especially hungry Alpha father and son make it back safely to their island stronghold back at home. Spike's mother, Isla Jodie Calmer, is bedridden with a mysterious illness, not the rage virus, but something that's causing her mind to drift in and out of coherence as her body wastes away, determined to save her life. Spike sneaks Isla off the island and onto the mainland. He has heard tales of a doctor who has survived the virus and might be able to diagnose his mother's condition on their journey. They encounter not only zombie threats of both the speedy and sluggish variety, but a surly Swedish soldier, Edvin Writing, who's been stranded on the mainland after a shipwreck. Here presents Spike's first encounter with a pre-virus world, bearing with him such novel items as a machine gun and a now useless cell phone. Eventually, Spike and Isla make it to Drakels, and Ralph finds a confounding figure who paints his body orange with iodine to resist the virus, and who seems to have worked out a manageable, if not peaceful, coexistence with the infected hordes that surround his lonely compound. It's the rare movie that doesn't get at least 20% better when Ralph Fiennes appears, and though his arrival here comes late in the story, his presence brings a sense of moral clarity that briefly lifts this hectic movie into a different, quieter dimension. Fiennes' arc also appears to be setting in place some mythology that the next installment, titled 28 Days Later, The Bone Temple, will build on. And an action movie with a 12-year-old protagonist is a risky proposal, but the 14-year-old actor Alfie Williams is up to the challenge. His performance as the courageous but frightened and at times still childlike Spike is a big part of what grounds 28 years later in a recognizable emotional reality, even amid all the guts-gobbling zombies acting opposite such powerhouses as Fiennes and the ever-excellent Calmer, who makes what could have been a generic damsel-in-distress character into a specific, flawed, and lovable woman. Williams delivers a vivid performance. It's to be hoped he will return in the next installment, as is implied in this movie's bizarre but intriguing final moments. In 2001, 28 Days Later was filmed on the then unusual format of consumer-grade digital video. 28 Years Later was shot with an even more daring Technique courtesy of the legendary cinematographer Anthony Dodd Mantle, returning with a custom-built rig mounted with up to 20 iPhones simultaneously, allowing for quick cuts among multiple angles on the same image at once, along with the use of freeze frames and dramatic caned angles. This editing style, used mainly in the action sequences, makes for a fragmented music video. If style experience with an almost punk rock sense of immediacy, the effect is at times thrilling but frequently also vaguely nauseating. If you aren't a fan of experiencing the latter sensation at the movies, I wouldn't recommend 28 Years Later, a movie that alternates serious dramatic moments with the kind of gleeful, half-comedic gore that enthusiasts of the horror genre will delight in, including one scene showing an especially menacing alpha whose weapon of choice is a freshly harvested human head wrung from its still-attached spinal column like a medieval mace on a chain zombie films, more than any other horror genre, with the possible exception of the vampire movie, have a way of lending themselves to allegorical readings that incorporate elements from the political and cultural moment when they were made Night of the Living Dead. The rare horror movie of its time with a black protagonist was in part about the ambient racism of the 1960s Dawn of the Dead, with its mall-invading monsters with critique of late 20th century consumerism. The first 28 Days movie was conceived before the 9/11 attacks, but its release, the year after they happened, inevitably made the film feel like a commentary on the new global order, with its paranoid fear of an insidious invading force. 28 Weeks Later, which featured an American-led occupying force attempting to rebuild a decimated Britain, was read by many critics as an allegory for the Iraq War, coming in the wake of both COVID and Brexit 28 years later, with its vision of an isolated Britain seen accursed and untouchable by the European mainland, also seems pregnant with symbolic meanings that are thankfully never spelled out for the viewer. In so many words, there may be deeper, more intangible fears buried beneath this roady rock-us thriller's grody surface. Luckily, you won't have time to stop and ponder them while you're being chased by a super-sized zombie wielding a severed head. Other information about this film and depicted by Garland: it's been almost 3 decades since the rage virus escaped a biological weapons laboratory, and now still in a ruthlessly enforced quarantines, some have found ways to exist amidst the infected. One such group of survivors lives on a small island connected to the mainland by a single heavily defended causeway when one of the group leaves the land on a mission into the dark heart of the mainland. They discover secrets, wonders, and horrors that have mutated not only the infected, but other survivors as well. The film stars Jodie and Taylor Johnson, Ralph Fiennes, and Jack Unnell. The buzz has been big on the prequel late last year. Sony reported that an early trailer for the flick in its first week of release became the most watched horror trailer in 2024 at 60.2 meters global views and the second biggest trailer of all time behind it. Chapter 2, 96 million views. Alex Garland's script makes great play of how life in Britain has become stunted. Wise wrote, flirting with folk horror, he makes the islanders little better than the infected, inviting comparisons with the Wicker Man as they carouse in the community center, while a faded portrait of Her Majesty the Queen looks down. Aussie film magazine Film Inc. said 28 Years Later boasts uniformly excellent performances, with Taylor Johnson and Kamar both doing fine work, and Ralph Fiennes absolutely wonderful as poetic death-obsessed Dr. Ian Kelson. But the outlet notes that some horror fiends will find themselves disappointed with a movie that's too weird, too somber, too unresolved to deliver on the promised thrills. There's much that's terrifying and wonderful about 28 Years Later, but the ending is jarring and dumb in a kick-ass heavy metal way, and it breaks the mood. Stephanie Zucker wrote for the Back magazine It's Asif. Boyle had gotten cold feet about ending the movie on too solemn a note, but this ending, no matter how you feel about it, is really just a beginning. Boyle and Garland have 2 follow-up movies in the works. The next, already filmed, is directed by Nia Dosta of Candyman, and the Marvels Boyle will return for the third 28 Years Later. By comparison, incorporates the world building of its predecessor, but retains the intimacy of the original film. The magazine wrote, Garland's script rightfully observes that a few expository intertitles do more than enough to establish the world into which the audience and the film's characters are plunged into and then dials into the lives of a family that's doing its best to navigate an unimaginable situation, both environmentally and interpersonally. There is an early scene in 28 Days Later when Cillian Murphy's Jim rises from his hospital bed and wanders the empty streets of London, walking deserted miles through the city over the Thames past St. Paul's Cathedral. There is little more than wind-blown garbage and abandoned vehicles. An overturned double-decker bus is the only real suggestion of prior catastrophe. As Jim scales a flight of concrete steps, he snatches up piles of spilled cash and stuffs the bills into a plastic sack. He is not yet aware of just how useless these pieces of paper have become. Someone already said it far better than I ever could. Rigid, the skeleton of habit alone upholds the human frame. Director Danny Boyle and writer Alex Garland's genre-defining earliest zombie flick was rich with the suspense and efficient images. A man scooping up money amid the apocalypse contains so much commentary on the nature of modern society, capitalism, the ultimate futility of currency. All this with hardly any dialogue, and long before we meet one of the flesh-eating infected driving the film's dilemma. Now Boyle and Avir united for their long-anticipated sequel, 28 years later. It does what it says on the box and little else, without the polished gruesomeness of 2007's 28 Weeks Later, directed by Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, and lacking the raw energy and emotional depth of the original 28 Years Later, is staunchly visually and dramatically incoherent. It attempts some meditations on mortality and parental love into Brexit, but never sticks the landing as Boyle and Garland constantly milk a cheap laugh from the audience, or to introduce a new genetic strain of monster, while 28 Days Later examine human error, instinctual violence, and found family. 28 Years Later has a thin patina of muddied themes. The filmmakers seem only to be asking, what if there were still zombies? So it's been nearly 3 decades since the rage virus ravaged Great Britain, which is now under permanent quarantine. The infected have either starved to death or scurry through coastal England, subsisting on animal trolls and worms. A pool of survivors live on a small island tethered to the mainland by a causeway that can only be crossed at low tide. The self-sustaining community makes everything from scratch, but must venture to the mainland occasionally for firewood and deer meat. It is within this village that we meet Archer, Jamie Aaron Taylor-Johnson, and his 12-year-old son. Spike Alfie Williams, who is inexplicably deemed ready for his first kill, the pair ventures onto the mainland with far too few arrows for experienced archers, fending off zombies so that Spike can snuff out a few undead and ostensibly become a man. Almost nothing in the opening passage of this movie makes sense. Why does a slight 12-year-old need to go kill zombies who are safely separated from his village? Why does his father risk their lives without at least planning to bring back supplies? Why didn't they bring well-written characters? Make mistakes, of course, but the ones populating 28 Years Later exist, inconsistent with their implied survivalist tendencies, solely to move the plot forward and introduce what Boyle seems most interested in: new flavors of zombie. One thing that set 28 Days Later apart from other movies in the undead genre was the speed and ferocity that propelled its villains, quite unlike the lumbering corpses in Night of the Living Dead. Now, Boyle introduces a breed of squishy, slow-moving infected, as well as an alpha who is bigger and smarter than the regular zombies. As Jamie explains to Spike on their outing for a moment, I wondered if Boyle was exploring the idea of evolution, or a creature we see as monstrous, becoming more like us, or the equalizing of predator and prey. Nope, he's just bigger and smarter and runs around flaunting his zombie dong. There are a number of instances in 28 Years Later when it seems like Boyle and Garland are maybe scratching the surface of something, but then they take a sharp left, never to return. They also tend to briefly introduce characters for some attempt at thos or comedic relief, only to abruptly kill them off. The worst case is Eric Edvin, writing a Swedish Navy grunt who has been woefully deployed to fight the infected when Spike and Eric meet on the mainland. Boyle and Garland exploit the opportunity for low-hanging humor that feels unearned and throws the tone of the film completely out of whack. Eric has an iPhone on the verge of dying, so he shows Spike a photo of his fiancée as a gesture of goodwill. Her lips are swollen with filler and her eyes caked in makeup. Spike, who has never seen an iPhone or the wonders of plastic surgery, asks, "What's wrong with her face?" The cinematography and editing also mirror this painful tonal whiplash. Anthony Jodie Mantle's lower-grade digital footage in the first film enhanced the tangible sense of fear, and like the Blair Witch Project before it, gave it the texture of a documentary. But Mantle style in 28 Years Later, which was largely shot on iPhone strapped to custom rigs, just feels shaky for the sake of it. If anything, it ejects the viewer from the clutches. A Fear Boyle seems more interested in making the viewer feel like they are experiencing the motion of different characters, like a POV shooter in a video game. John Harris's editing is similarly fragmented in a manner that is mostly distracting as she splices in plenty of archival footage of men across history, mimicking the actions of the film's characters. This is a new trademark of Boylston he used to tedious extent in his punk miniseries Pistol. In 28 Years Later, Boyle has no penetrating insights into the nature of man. The best he can do is flash historical footage of human behavior and hope we can project meaning for him. More detail: a little over 2 decades ago, director Danny Boyle and screenwriter Alex Garland scared the bejesus out of audiences with their kinetic reinvention of the zombie-ter, both as high-intensity nail-biter and sharp political allegory. The 2002 feature remains among the most influential horror of the 21st century, while acknowledging a debt to the maestro it left. George A. Romero's lumbering undead in the dust, with fast-moving flesh-eaters that descended like a swarm on a ravaged Great Britain, isolated from the rest of the world, emotionally charged, visceral, and immersive. The new sequel, 28 Years Later, subverts expectations in many ways, not least by making a 12-year-old boy, Spike, played with a poignant balance of vulnerability and resilience by terrific newcomer Alfie Williams, the indisputable protagonist. The movie goes beyond a survival thriller by introducing tender familial drama, a stirring spiritual thread, and notes of sly humor. A Shell gas station with a missing S on its iconic sign is a nice touch, as is an attached diner called Happy Eater. This first part of a planned trilogy demonstrates that Boyle and Garland still have plenty of fresh inspiration for Ding terror, while the director has repeatedly distanced 28 Days Later from the zombie label. His exciting new Rage Virus installment is in a league not just with his own earlier film, but other genre standouts like Romero's Dawn of the Dead and Jan Sango's Train to Busan, skipping over the events of Juan Carlos Fresnadillo's 2007 sequel, 28 Weeks Later. Garland's script starts with an amusing dig at British isolationism, noting that the virus was driven back from continental Europe to be contained on the UK mainland. It's kind of like a reverse Brexit, flooding the island with the unwanted infected and leaving the Brits to fend for themselves, their shores patrolled by European military boats. There's an irreverent vein also in the prologue, showing a group of young children trying to ignore the worrying noises coming from adults in the next room while they watch a Teletubbies episode. Those gibberish spouting creatures with their fixed smiles, vacant eyes, and TV monitors embedded in their stomachs could be someone's trippy idea of infantilized post-apocalyptic humanoids. When a frenzied cluster of infected, as the virus carriers are known, collectively bursts through the door and the screaming starts, the video image of Dipsy Lollipur and Tinky Winky gets splashed with blood. One child, Jimmy, manages to escape, fleeing to a nearby church where it's revealed he's the son of a preacher. Man, his minister father is clearly deranged, welcoming the deathly mob to the day of judgment, but not before pressing a crucifix into Jimmy's trembling hand, telling the boy to keep it with him always. It's a sure thing that Jimmy will resurface Spike lives with his parents. Jamie Aaron Taylor Johnson and Isla Jodie Calmer on Holy Island, a landmass off the northeast coast of England, separated from the mainland by a causeway, accessible only at low tide. Isla is largely confined to bed upstairs, feverish with an undiagnosed illness that gives her severe pain and erratic lucidity. The lack of surviving doctors or medical treatments likely means her sickness will have to run its course one way or another. Members of the tight-knit community living behind fortress walls have designated roles: farmer, hunter, fisherman, forager, baker. They have fashioned a society along the lines of earlier times, untouched by the developments of the modern world beyond their outpost in this respect. Boyle and Garland give the new chapter shadings of British folk horror an aspect, enhanced by inserts of footage depicting England at war throughout history, from medieval times to World War II, like was herds of stampeding deer, flocks of crows overhead, and the eerie placement of Rudyard Kipling's 1903 warfare poem Boots Heard in an unsettling voiceover, although he's a couple years shy of the usual age at which islanders undertake their first expedition to the mainland. Jamie decides Spike is sufficiently mature and skilled in archery to accompany him on the crossing and notch up his first kill of an infected. The community's festive send-off identifies this as an important rite of passage, though the gatekeeper reminds Spike that no rescuers or search parties will be sent after colonists that fail to return. The corpulent, slug-like ground crawlers known as slolos are fleshy, misshapen blobs with slimy sides that look like grotesque Botto sculptures. The infected, familiar from the original virus strain, are now sinew figures wandering the land, feral and naked, their clothes having disintegrated long ago. The most dangerous are the hulking berserkers, more commonly known as alphas, on whom the virus has had a steroidal effect, allowing them to tear the heads off victims and swing them around by their spinal cords. The chief specimen here, played by MMA fighter Chai Lewis Perry, is a massive beast whose brute strength is matched by his cunning, not to mention his pendulous whopper of a penis, a prosthetic that rivals Alexander Skarsgård's in Pillion. All goes well at first as Jamie guides Spike through verdant woodlands and fields, reminding him to aim for the head or heart. The lad soon enough nails his first kill, planting a lethal arrow in a slow low. The more interesting part of the scene is the evidence of family groups having formed among the infected. The mournful cries of nearby slows draw attention from other infected in the area who plant themselves along the top of a picturesque hill, waiting for the alpha's signal to attack. That stunning long shot is a classic English pastoral scene, its bucolic tranquility broken by menacing savages that look like refugees from an earlier millennium. The flight through the forest is one of many thrilling sequences, with the infected hot on Jamie and Spike's heels, coming at them faster than they can aim their arrows. They take refuge in an abandoned farm building, hiding out in the loft until low tide. The following morning during the night, Spike spots a fire in the distance, which Jamie shrugs off as nothing at the celebration that follows their hair-raising return to Holy Island. Spike is disturbed by his father's exultant untruths, regaling the crowd with false accounts of his son's heroics, when the squeamish boy had been too petrified to be of use during the attack. That confusion about his father's dishonesty is magnified when he observes Jamie sneaking off from the party to have sex with a young village woman, even more so when old-timer family friend Sam Christopher Fulford tells him the fire he saw was probably lit by Dr. Kersonen. Ralph Fiennes, a former physician known for his eccentric ways. Jamie says Kersonen is insane, but Spike is now convinced he's a liar following a bitter clash with his dad. Spike sets up a distraction in order to get his dying mother off the island and travel through dangerous countryside in search of the doctor. Spike and his mother becomes the heart of the film, rendered more affecting by Isla's delirium, which causes her constantly to confuse her son with her late father. But she's sufficiently present for her maternal instinct to kick in during a close call, revealed through the haze of her mind. The cast across the board is solid, and Taylor Johnson conveys the conflicts of a loving father and husband in dark times. Kamar is the movie's standout Isla. Slowly and subtly transforms on the mainland from her bedraggled, sickly appearance, becoming more beautiful as if she's drawing strength from nature. There are gripping interludes in which they travel for a time, with young Swedish naval officer Eric Edvin riding the last survivor of a patrol boat wrecked on the shores of Scotland, Scotch on the rocks. He waggishly calls it a reference as mystifying to Spike as the stranger's cell phone and night vision helmet. Eric laments that he should have been a delivery driver in what seems a nod back to the Cillian Murphy character's profession as a bicycle courier in the first movie. Perhaps the boldest scene takes place in a train carriage, where Isla comes to the aid of an infected in distress, inadvertently alerting the Alpha to their presence. The movie is at its most moving when they finally reach Cursonen and behold the magnificent moment, a temple he has built out of skulls and bones to honor the dead, while Heelzo honors love among the living by protecting Spike, and Isla bringing the piece that liberates set is the masterstroke of production and costume designers Gareth Pugh and Carson McCall. The performances of Comrie Williams and Fiennes give 28 years later a soulful core. That was also a distinguishing factor in the 2002 original, a testament to the endurance of humanity even in the darkest dystopias. Fiennes is wonderful in the choice's supporting role of Curson. Half-possessed wild man and half-learned man of science is body Dobdinyoden, which acts as a deterrent to the infected shot by Anthony Dodi Mantle on the sprawling canvas of the 2.76:1 widescreen aspect ratio often used for IMAX or Ultra Panavision. 70 the movie's visual textures are intoxicating. The dynamic muscularity of the camera work is matched by John Harris' similarly agile editing laced with nerve jangling. Smash cuts and Johnny Byrne's enveloping sound design works in seamless tandem with the wide-ranging score by Scottish indie art pop alternative hip-hop outfit. Young Father's Boyle has always been a genius in his inventive use of music. The sequence featuring Iggy Pop's Lust for Life in Trainspotting is an Alzheimer. Here he weaves in disturbing passages of ambient synth distortion with propulsive action riffs bristling with violent drum beats. Any film that includes both the solemn 19th century Scottish hymn, Abide With Me, and a ferocious blast of death metal is not playing it safe. One of the chief rewards of 28 years later is that it never feels like a cynical attempt to revisit proven material merely for commercial reasons. Instead, the filmmakers appear to have returned to a story whose allegorical commentary on today's grim political landscape seems more relevant than ever. Intriguing narrative building blocks put in place for future installments meant they can't come fast enough. Point 3 films released in theaters this week. Pixar's story on loneliness. Elio Amir Khan sharing the screen with special needs actors Sadar Zaman, and Danny Bowles return to zombie apocalypse 28 years later. And I can bet my soul nobody could have guessed the last one would be the most emotionally charged tearjerker of the three. Also read Sitar's Am Parmovi review. Amir Khan's heartwarming film stumbles then source says to score a basket in the second half, right from its promotions to its trailer, and Event the Way 28 years later opens the Danny Bowl. Film is full of misdirection. We have been led to believe that it is an action-packed zombie horror led by Aaron Taylor Johnson, he of Avengers and Craven fame. That last one may not be the perfect thing on the resume, but the film is far from that. Yes, there is a post-apocalyptic society. Yes, there are zombies, and yes, there is tons of fighting and running around, but 28 years later is an emotional coming-of-age drama disguised as horror at its heart. Is 14-year-old Alfie Williams, who delivers a performance they will talk about for years, perhaps decades, as the title suggests. 28 years later is set 28 years after the events of the first two films of the franchise. Britain is a quarantine zone overrun by the undead. The US and Europe seem to be thriving, but just off the coast of the Scottish Highlands, a band of survivors has built their safe haven on an island connected to the mainland by a causeway only accessible during low tide. James Aaron Taylor Johnson takes his 12-year-old son, Spike Alfie Williams, to the mainland to show him the ropes, but Alfie discovers that his father has lied about many things, including the presence of a doctor. The 12-year-old decides to turn with his sick mother. Isla Jod Comrand asks the mysterious Doc Kelson Ralph finds for a cure. This while he must navigate his own and experience his mother's hallucinations and waves of the undead. 28 years later begins on a disjointed note, and the initial setup does test your patience, but technically the film hooks you in really quickly. They Cinematography by Jodie Mantle, and that haunting score from Young Fathers' brilliant. Mantle in particular brings the soul of the franchise back, merging it with every Alex Garland-like visual style. The filmmaker is the writer here. The end result is an almost graphic novel-like work of art that may be abstract at times, but visually engaging at all times. The score is a delicious cherry on top. It may have been billed as a zombie horror, but 28 years later has less than 20 on-screen deaths during its near 2-hour runtime. The focus is more on survival. In Spike's crusade to find a cure for his dying mother, he's not afraid to fight back against this flawed father and even engage in some light arson to get this way. Alfie Williams is a star one I hope gives us these performances for years to come. If Bella Ramsey was already setting the bar high for child actors in horror and fantasy shows, Alfie is staking it through the stratosphere here, even in scenes with the legendary Ralph Fiennes. The 14-year-old steals the show, a marvelous achievement for someone that young and inexperienced. There is a scene right before the climax of the film, where the young Spike must come to terms with mortality for the first time. It is a touching sequence filmed with minimal background score and punctuated by Alfie Williams' breaths. Just how beautifully Danny Boyle has managed. It was evident by the pinropsilence in the packed Mumbai theater, where I watched the film. The only blemish on the film is the bizarre final sequence where Boyle brings his train-spotting goofiness in a Tarantino-esque fight sequence that honestly feels a bit out of place in this film, but that can be overlooked for 110 minutes of classic cinema. If Naz Vera brought back good old noir back to horrors, Sinners married the genre with musical in a stunning experiment, and now 28 years later brings a coming-of-age tale in the genre that is 3 films pushing the envelope in the genre. In the space of 6 months, the golden age of Novo horror is certainly on in Hollywood. Extra information when you make a movie called 28 Days Later, and it becomes Zeitgeist shifting hit these sequel titles. Sort of Right Themselves 28 Weeks Later came out in 2007. But the franchise's stewards missed their window for 28 months later. Instead, director Danny Boyle and writer Alex Garland finally reteamed some 23 years after the original for 28 years later, and perhaps sensing that a 28 decades later might not work within the series' horror mill, they turned their sequel into the first chapter of a trilogy of new films, the second 28 years later. The Bone Temple is already in post-production and scheduled for release next year. The third film will get made seems likely, although I doubt 28 years later will leave as large an imprint on horror cinema as 28 Days Later did. It permanently rewrote the rules of cinematic zombies, popularizing a faster variant of creatures that previously shuffled toward their victims at a snail's pace, while 28 years later features plenty of the series' signature fast zombies. It also includes several new types of monsters, including in what feels like a wry nod to the franchise's enormous influence, extremely slow-moving ghouls that crawl along the ground like human or zombie worms. 28 years later also adds some new visual dimensions into the series' lo-fi aesthetic, where 28 Days Later was shot on grainy digital video. 28 years later utilizes high-end iPhones for a look that's cleaner and crisper with intermittent flashes of that first-generation digital video look. Boyle and cinematographer Jodie Mantle also add a few grander flourishes, including the use of a rig that could capture 20 different camera angles simultaneously, which believed to add what he described in one interview as a poor man's bullet time effect to zombie kills, as a result 28 years later doesn't look much like 28 Days Later's. Structurally thought their similarities, both movies drop the viewer into the middle of reasonably plausible zombie apocalypses, then slowly add increasingly surreal and nightmarish elements. The new film opens on a small land separated from the mainland by a causeway that gives residents a degree of safety and protection from the victims of the rage virus that decimated England more than a quarter century ago. There we meet Jamie Aaron Taylor-Johnson, one of the Island's top zombie hunters, along with his son Spike Alfie Williams, now 12 years old. Spike accompanies James to the mainland for the first time, where he will hopefully score his first zombie kill as a sort of rite of passage into manhood that makes 28 years later every dark coming-of-age story, although not always in the ways one expects. Spike's mother, Isla Jodie Comer, spends much of the movie bedridden and delirious with a mysterious disease that none of the Island's limited medical supplies can cure. Spike's first hunt includes several surprises, along with hints that the world beyond his little island is not quite what he's been told. Jamie and the other village elders on a night Spike spots a mysterious fire burning in the distance. But his father feigns ignorance and refuses to talk about it later. Villager whispers that it may belong to a doctor who went mad and now lives among the zombies, like an even more twisted version of Kurtz from Heart of Darkness 28 years later's early sequences do a masterful job of bringing the audience into its highly detailed post-apocalyptic society with almost no exposition or setup. Garland, one of cinema's foremost designers of fantastical fictional realities, lets the world of 28 years later reveal itself. Through action and clipped bits of dialogue, the audience learns about how this world evolved over the last 28 years, right alongside Spike, as she wanders through the English countryside, encountering increasingly terrifying monsters, and getting his first bitter taste of adulthood then near the film's midpoint. Garland's script darts off in a different direction from there. 28 years later gets progressively weirder and darker, and somewhat surprisingly funnier. I am not sure all of these elements cohere into a unified whole, and if you're the kind of moviegoer easily put off by multi-part movies with cliffhanger endings like Dune or Wicked, you might be really annoyed by 28 years later non-conclusion. While I share some of that disappointment, what I liked about this part of the movie is how wild and bold it gets. Boyle and Garland do not rest on their laurels. Nothing about 28 years later feels like a shameless retread for the sake of easy box office. Especially in that second half, they really reach for something, a statement about the meaning of life and death, the slow decay of the British Empire, and the need to appreciate the remaining beauty of a planet that already seems past the point of repair, whether or not the film fully sticks the landing or brings all these threads together in a way that makes sense. I appreciated Boyle and Garland's effort to mirror their characters to push this familiar franchise into new and unexplored territory. Also appreciated the fact that while this movie clearly sets up at least one sequel 28 years later, is not exactly a crowd pleaser Revan in the Dark way a bloody horror film, might please its target audience. Yes, 28 years later is gory and violent, and the zombie kills with that jerky bullet. Time phone rigger are cool, but the film is also thoughtful, even contemplative at times. It's sad, it's depressing. Its ending feels deliberately designed to frustrate some viewers. Not because Boyle and Garland want to leave the door open for sequels, but because life so often turns out in frustrating ways. That's another bold choice, even if it is one that could potentially imperil their long-term plans to make 28 years later movies for several more years. This film, directed by Danny Boyle, written by Alex Garland, produced by Danny Boyle, Alex Garland, Andrew Macdonald, Peter Rice, Bernie Bello, starring Jodie Comer, Aaron Taylor Johnson, Alfie Williams, Jack O'Connell, Ralph Fiennes cinematography. Anthony Doty Mantle, edited by John Harris. Music by Young Fathers Production Companies. Din Films, Decibel Films, distributed by Columbia Pictures through Sony Pictures. Releasing release dates June 19th, 2025 in UK, June 20th, 2025 in US. Running time 115 minutes. Countries: United Kingdom. United States language English. Budget $60 million. Box office $5.8 million. So guys, this is the review of 28 Years Later movie and some information about it. How do you like our today's video? Please let us know by commenting. And if you like this video, please like it, share it, and don't forget to subscribe West Films to our channel. Thanks for watching.